This is Duke University.
And thank you all for having taken time to come. We are excited to have you here and excited to have this very distinguished panel joining us. So as you can imagine, ISIS or ISIL or IS or Daesh or whatever they wish to be called this week is a topic that has covered been covered with a great deal of attention recently, oftentimes, however, with a little bit more heat than light. So what we thought we would do would be to call on the expertise of the faculty that we have and come at this rather complex phenomena from a number of vantage points. And my hope is that once you've heard about them from the point of view of American foreign policy, from the point of view of Arab politics, from the point of view of terrorist organizations and counterterrorism, and the usual love and justice bit from me, then we might be able to have a more nuanced conversation. So let me just read the introduction that we had thought of as a frame for our discussion. With a war raging in Syria that spilled over into Iraq, militant groups jockeying for attention and control, and a sobering post-Arab Spring reality that's seen traditional alliances upended, political Islam scrutinized, and dissent stifled. 4 Duke faculty members, including myself, will put the latest developments and the relevance for America in perspective. What's next for us in the Middle East? Allow me, if I may, to introduce your distinguished panelists, and then we will move through in the order that folks are seated. We're going to begin with Professor Bruce Jentleson, a professor of public policy and political science at Duke University, and also a core faculty with the Sanford School. He specializes in international relations, US foreign policy, human rights, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He's affiliated with the Duke Islamic Studies Center and has served a number of US policy and political positions, and is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Abdeslam Maghraoui, an associate professor of practice of political science, also a core faculty member of the Duke Islamic Studies Center. His research addresses key political challenges facing states and societies in North Africa and the Middle East today. Among these are questions of democratization, the role of religion in public life, which incidentally is part of a new initiative here at Duke University, spearheaded by our Dean Lori Patton, youth empowerment, and governance. And then we're going to hear from Professor David Schanzer, well known, I'm sure, to many of you, Associate Professor of the Practice in the Sanford School of Public Policy, and the Director of the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security, specializing in counterterrorism strategy and national security. Professor Schanzer is also a core faculty with the Duke Islamic Studies Center. Prior to his academic appointments, he held several positions in the legislative and executive branches of the US government. So with that as background, we're going to begin, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes or so before we open it up for questions. So with that, Professor Jentleson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Omid, for the introduction, and to my colleagues on the panel, and Julie and others who organized this. So in May, June 2013, I was in Australia as a visiting scholar at Australian National University. I was giving a talk one night in Sydney, and somebody in the audience asked about the pivot to Asia, and raised their hand and said, you know, what happens if the Middle East gets in the way of the pivot? To which my response was, you know, whatever you want to say about the pivot, it had to be in addition to, not instead of, other areas of concern for U.S. foreign policy. The Middle East never goes away, and this was 2013, before the Syria chemical weapons, ISIS, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to make, in a very limited time, just put some things on the table. Sort of 5 issues that I think need to happen. The title of our panel is The Middle East in Turmoil, for the Middle East to be at least in less turmoil. And talk about the issues and about U.S. policy. And I did serve in the Obama administration from 2009-2011 as a senior advisor at the State Department, working on the Middle East, but a range of other issues. And I have to say, I wish I could defend the policies more than I can. Some aspects I can, but much I can't. And so I'm just going to give you my own sense of things. So 5 main issues, not comprehensive, and putting them on the table to be elaborated on, many of them by my colleagues, and not in any particular order. The first one, I think, is that the Arab states, many of which are U.S. allies, need to gain greater legitimacy with their own people. There are many factors of that. I would simply stress 2 main things that have to happen. One is a political inclusiveness, which includes political Islam, and the other is some social and economic progress sufficient that people can feel, as they say, the arrow starting to point in the right direction, a better life for their children than for them, even if all the problems aren't solved in the moment. Going back many, many years in terms of U.S. policy and its relations with many of its allies in the Middle East, Sunni Arab monarchies and other countries, it really sort of followed 2 dictums, if you will. One was, as they say, I can say this on web streaming, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, which is we paid attention more to who they allied with in the Cold War and other aspects of foreign policy, and whatever the rhetoric about democracy and human rights didn't really pay attention to what happened internally. I think it was true for dictators like Mubarak, it was true for Sunni monarchies and the like. And the other was what I called in an article I wrote a couple of years ago during the Arab Spring, the duck test. During the Cold War, when U.S. Ambassador to Guatemala was called before a congressional committee to talk about why the United States had supported the CIA overthrow of a democratically elected government in Guatemala that was seen to be somewhat allied on the left. And he said, you know, we call it the duck test. You know, if you see a duck in an animal in the farmyard, you're not sure if it's a duck, but it walks like a duck, and talks like a duck, and hangs around with a duck, you assume it's a duck. And that was the way we dealt with many nationalist regimes in the Cold War that we accused of being communist. And I think we need to avoid the duck test in the Middle East, particularly today. There are going to be elements of political Islam which we will see as adversaries, and I think are inimical to the interests of their own people. And there'll be elements, I think, in which need to be part of the solution. So we need to avoid the duck test in our allies, in our relations with our Arab states, with our Arab allies. Again, more to be said about that, but I'm confident my colleagues will do that. Second is on Syria. So ISIS comes along, and now there's all this attention to Syria. But you know, the impact of what was happening in Syria was more broadly destabilizing the region long before we decided whether it was ISIS or ISIL or IS or whatever. I was in, just to give you a couple of examples, I was in Jordan earlier in 2014 in January with a policy delegation from a think tank in Washington, and we met in Jordan with advisors to the king. And at that time he said to us, right now there are 650,000 Syrian refugees in Jordan. He said, as a percentage of the Jordanian population, that's the equivalent to if the entire population of Canada fled to the United States. And there's some statistics that really capture things for you. And so the destabilizing effects of what's been happening in Syria in 2011, in Jordan, in Lebanon, feeding into the sectarian conflict in Lebanon. There have been 6 or 7 incidents with the Israelis in or near the Golan Heights. None of them have escalated yet, but it's only a matter of time until they do. And so Syria, you know, long before ISIS, and ISIS has captured the attention, has had a serious destabilizing effect, as well as, talking about this in my class today a little bit, you know, profound humanitarian issue within Syria itself. I will say this is, you know, the United States has not had a successful policy, but I think we also need to pay attention to who in the international community have been principal obstacles to action in Syria, and Russia really needs to come in for a heck of a lot of criticism. It has continually blocked Security Council action in the UN, has continued to support the Assad regime, and so while that doesn't take away from criticisms one can have of what the US has done and not done, I think sometimes we focus on just the US and we tend to let people like Putin kind of off a little too easily. And I think if Russia had not been blocking this, going way back to early 2011, we could have seen more concerted action on the part of the international community. Third is ISIS, and I know David and others will talk more about this. But I think that my one point, or a couple points would be, one is people are going to agree or disagree with different parts of U.S. policy. I happen to have supported the airstrikes as a part of the policy. But I think my view has been twofold. One, it needs to be a part of a policy, not the only one. It sort of contains and buys a little time. The advances ISIS was making, but you need to use that time. And secondly, the United States needs to be acting there with our allies, not for them. You know, to many of them, this is an existential threat. To us, it's a significant threat. And I think that part of it goes back to my first point, in working with allies in the region, whether it's the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Egyptians, we can't do it in a way that goes back to losing sight, you know, of not supporting the ways in which they're repressing their own peoples in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, to a certain extent, in the Emirates, perhaps a little bit less so. But I think that's an important part. We can't lose sight of the venality of ISIS. We'll say, well, you know, they grew up because of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, 2003. You know, there's truth to that. But the way that they're treating the people in the areas they come to dominate, women and others, we can't lose sight of that as well. Last 2 points I want to make on the table. One is about Iran and U.S. relations with Iran. This really goes back to 1979 and the Iranian Revolution. It goes back deeper than that. We can talk about that. But I think this was really, in many respects, the beginning, I think, of a major role for Islamism in the Middle East in terms of the Islamic Republic of Iran being the first government, I think, in which it came to power. We should have no illusions about the role Iran has played in the region, the role in supporting terrorism, killing American soldiers in Iraq, arms to Hamas, the role in Lebanon, pursuing nuclear weapons and the like. But we achieved détente with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and we've developed relations with China. There are politics on both sides, and right now you have hardliners in the US and hardliners in Iran, neither of which want to see this initial deal on nuclear non-proliferation, which I might add is one issue in which the US, China, Russia, and others have continued to work together. The rough deadline is November 24th. It's not that far away about coming to a deal. But I think there's real possibilities for improving relations with Iran beyond that. And I think to the extent that we are able to do that, I think it'll be good for the Iranian people, it'll be good for the region, and it'll be good for the United States. And one needs to realize that you know, if you achieve détente with the Soviets, there's nothing inherent, I don't believe, in the relation between the United States and Iran that should stop us from a more broad improvement of relations. And fifth is Israeli-Palestinian peace. And again, this is not in any order of priority. And here, too, there's plenty of fault to go all around. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in particular, I think, has had a lack of a genuine commitment to a two-state solution. I think the expansion of Israeli settlements, something the Obama administration has been critical of the Israelis on, perhaps not as much as people would like. When I was in the Middle East in January, we were in Bethlehem. We met with the mayor of Bethlehem. And we were talking about the efforts to develop an economy, including tourism at Christmas time, and the difficulties in doing that, given the settlements and the checkpoints. We had a session at the University of Bethlehem with some students and faculty, and one of the students there said to me that she lived in Ramallah with her family, was commuting to Bethlehem for her classes, and she never knew how much time to leave to get to class. How much time is it going to take through the checkpoints? And I said, you know, I've been a professor for a lot of years. I've heard a lot of reasons for missing class, and I've never had to have a student tell me it was because of a checkpoint. So there's plenty of fault all around. I think on the Israeli side, they have not, particularly under this prime minister, not under Prime Minister Rabin, who genuinely pursued peace. I think there is on the Palestinian side Hamas, which continues to not question the terms of peace, but whether there be any peace at all, refusing to recognize Israel's existence. President Abbas, I think, has had a number of opportunities, including in March of this year when President Obama tried to work with him to move the negotiations forward. And on the US side, I think we've made a lot of mistakes on how we've gone about this. And again, I'm just putting it out there to elaborate on. I guess I'd end on the two truths. The only two truths I think I know about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. One is as hard as it is today, it's harder tomorrow. When the Camp David Accords were signed with Egypt in 1978-79, there were two parts to them, Israeli-Egyptian peace and a framework for moving ahead on the Palestinian issue. Didn't happen. When the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, they were supposed to be done in 5 years. And whether it's more settlements or more socialization, the hatred on both sides, it's a lot harder today than it was then, and it'll be a lot harder tomorrow than it is today. And from an Israeli point of view, as one Israeli high-ranking security official once said to me, we cannot be sure that peace will bring security, but we can be sure we will never have security without peace. And I think there is a sense of that from an Israeli perspective, at least on the parts of some, not necessarily the existing government. And so I think those are all the more reasons to try to move ahead on these issues, perhaps with some creative and different ways we've tried to advance the peace talks than before. People talk about a one-state solution, etc. I don't think that's a solution. I think the only solution is a two-state solution, two states living side by side in peace and security, fulfilling the aspirations for our own state, the Palestinian people, and for security with the Israelis. So anyway, that's kind of a little bit of tour of the horizon on my part. I'll pass it to Mike.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk actually about slightly different topic, more on the Arab Spring, or why the waves of popular uprising did not really lead to any kind of successful or positive political change in the region. I mean, it is related, but it's not quite directly related to ISIS. So across the region, I mean, this popular uprising has begun asking for dignified life, for justice, or end up in failure. In Libya and Syria, we have open, bloody civil wars. So it is very tempting to deduce from this that, well, there is some kind of cultural explanation to this problem. I mean, if it is across the region in different contexts, there has to be some kind of, cultural foundation for this. I think it is very important to keep in mind, even in their failures, the different paths that they took. And I want to talk about 3 different cases in North Africa. Libya, the worst case that we have, Egypt, and Tunisia, where we saw some progress. I mean, just yesterday there were some elections and seem to be moving forward. So why is it that these 3 cases or these 3 countries have really followed different paths, even as they failed or even as they succeeded? So my suggestion, I think that it's a lot of these patterns have to do with the kind of the institutional arrangements that we see in different cases. I mean, where solid institutions are in place, where there's the institutional framework in place, it is much easier to negotiate conflicts that might arise in these contexts. So in the case of Libya, it is very clear. I mean, today we have different warring factions based either on tribal agglomerations or militias associated with towns, tribal groups, all fighting together. And in fact, today in Libya, there are like basically 2 capitals, one in Benghazi and one in Bayla in the eastern Libya. Both of them are equally powerless and submissive to their own kind of armed groups. And so this really explains the chaotic situation in Libya. Part of this, I mean, I think that's the vacuum, the institutional vacuum that the Gaddafi's regime left behind. Basically, if you are familiar with Libya, it was called the Jamahiriya, the people's rule in Libya, which basically meant that there were no basic national institutions that any modern state really should have. And once the Gaddafi regime collapsed, there was nothing, there were no political figures who are accepted to all parties, came forward. There were no viable institutions, and therefore it was really the problem with starting the negotiations and resolving all of these conflicts. So in this case, it's very clear that where you have no institutional foundation, you are going to have a lot of problems. Even though in the case of Libya, the conflict is not sectarian, it's not about different religious groups. Nonetheless, it is necessary to have some kind of viable institutions to negotiate transitions to more democracy. Now, in Egypt has a longer tradition of institutions. There is really no excuse why Egyptians could not get together and work out some kind of arrangement. But the problem in Egypt is that from the very beginning, the military institution was entrusted with the supreme power to arbitrate. I mean, when you entrust institutions with binding arbitrations, you are endowed it with supreme power and authority. And of course, the military took care of itself and on its members before it could think about the democratic process. So the whole process of democratic transitions, the institutions, the system of the days of the electoral process was really supervised by the military officers, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And what's helped them a lot is also the Muslim Brotherhood. Once it became a powerful force in the country, it was much less willing to compromise. So every time there was a conflict over what elections should come first, what are the prerogatives of the Constituent Assembly, what should be the limits on executive powers or the powers of the president. They resorted, basically the Muslim Brotherhood and the secular parties resorted to street protests, mobilization, and this really weakened the possibility of any kind of negotiations to work out some kind of consensual framework, and they resorted to the military to arbitrate this kind of conflicts. By the end, we know what happened. The military intervened, took advantage of the president's failure to deliver, the Muslim Brotherhood's inability to deliver on basic issues, on the socio-economic needs of the countries, and the unpopularity of the Muslim Brotherhood. Unfortunately, I mean, in this case, what is really worrisome about the potential or the prospects for democracy in Egypt is that the secular forces, the youth movements who participated initially in the protest accepted the role of the military, accepted the interruption of the constitutional and democratic process. And for me, this is really a bad sign to me that there is still some kind of, that the military is still seen as the supreme arbitrator, and it has still a lot of political weight in the country. In Tunisia, on the other hand, despite the common social, economic, and political problems that any country in transition encounter, they managed to sit down and negotiate. The military was never part of the process, but this is a really kind of historical legacy that the military in Tunisia was always excluded from politics. When Ali's regime was more so like a police state rather than military state, unlike in Egypt, and therefore the military was never really called to supervise the transition process. Tunisia also has a longer history of civil society activism. It has one of the best human rights organizations in the region. It has very strong, independent group of lawyers. Women's groups are also very active, and this really proved to be very useful when it came to when the Islamists of Ennahda tried to impose their will on the rest of society. They mobilized. It was through a long process, hard work, and in the end, this year they passed a constitution by one of the best, one of the most progressive, moderate constitutions, I think, in the Arab world, that preserves certain rights, the right to freedom of religion, women's equality. So I think that the institutional fabric really explains why we have these different paths in these countries. One more interesting and last point about Tunisia is that in Tunisia there was very little external interference, either from Europe, the United States, or money from the Gulf countries, for example. There was no attempt to kind of manipulate or push one party over another to change the balance of power. And I think this is very interesting because when you have external interference, it does complicate the domestic dynamic. And in Tunisia was the least exposed to external pressure. It was basically domestic-driven process by political actors from within. So,
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first let me take the opportunity to thank Julie and DISC for putting this on, and also to publicly welcome Omid Safi to Duke. Usually when we steal something from UNC, it's a McDonald's All-American basketball player, but I think we stole something from UNC, and I think Duke is going to benefit for quite a while from that. Of course, it's an honor to be on a panel with Bruce and Abdeslam, my colleagues and friends. So I'm supposed to be the terrorism guy on this panel. I'm going to tell you about ISIS and you know, whether we should be worried about what happened in Canada and crazy people going after police officers in New York City with axes. But actually, I'm going to, I think, try to actually take us to a higher level of abstraction, 10,000 feet, perhaps, where my colleagues were maybe a little lower to the ground. And I was thinking about this, the title of the panel, Turmoil in the Middle East, which, by the way, I suggested, so I'm not being critical at all. But it gives this idea that, well, we're in a period of turmoil now, and that somehow that's different from what preceded it, and that this is a different era. But let's understand, we had a period of a long period of colonialism in the Middle East, followed by a long period of brutal, lengthy autocracy in the Middle East. And these were covering over and suppressing a different type of turmoil that was present in society. So we didn't experience it as turmoil in the same way maybe we're experiencing the present state. But turmoil it was because there were forces that were being oppressed, a dissatisfaction, and it was being, the status quo, the so-called stability, was being created, preserved by some very powerful forces, an iron hand, so to speak. Now, during this entire period, even the period of colonialism and the period of autocracy and dictatorship, the one force that couldn't be totally oppressed, the one force that couldn't be squeezed out of society in the same way as civil society or unions or any of those other kinds of mediating mechanisms that create healthy society, was Islam and the mosque. And throughout all this period, the opposition to whatever the status quo was a form of Islam, whether it was, this is the context in which political Islam rose, was as an opposition to colonialism, as an opposition to autocracy. So in many ways, it was very much an oppositional movement. Now, when you're an oppositional movement, you are mostly saying what you're against, and very rarely saying what you're for. And you're not really always required to develop what you are for. And that leads to problems when the powers, whether it be the colonial powers, the autocrats, are no longer there, and it's possible for you to share or participate in society and in power. So, so that's where we were. I think in the last 2 decades we've experienced 3 explosions that have disturbed the status quo, the old turmoil that's brought us to the new turmoil. The first explosion was 9/11. And 9/11 was a demonstration that a particular type of player in the Middle East, the player of the radical violent extremist organization that arose, we can talk about that, but arose out of, in some ways, an oppositional notion, a radical interpretation of Islam, a distorted interpretation, but it arose out of the political Islam movement, but a gross distortion of it. So that was, 9/11 was an expression that we're here and we're going to express power, and we're going to be a player in what the modern Middle East looks like. The second explosion, of course, was the invasion of Iraq by the United States, which removed an autocrat and shifted power in this region from a Sunni-dominated power to a Shia-dominated power, and also empowered Iran. So it was a huge action that shifted in a tectonic way, in some way, the balance of power in the heart of the region. And the third explosion, and Abdeslam has described it very well, of course, was the Arab uprisings starting in 2011, sweeping through Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Yemen, Libya, and then, of course, Syria, with differing impacts, players, and balances of power in all of those places. And all of this, of course, the Arab uprisings were a huge challenge to the status quo. So where does that leave us? So those are the explosions that I think led us to the moment where we are. And I think it's been well described that there are multiple civil wars going on in this region, if you look at it. You have in Syria, you have the Assad regime versus a highly fragmented opposition that has everything from potential Democrats to ISIS, which is almost, Bruce well described the depravity of this movement. But you also have a competition, a very strong competition between Iran and Syria that is affecting the power in the region. You have the Shia versus Sunni rivalry that is playing itself out in Syria and many other places. You have a civil war between the modernists and the extremists. Between the countries that want to live in the globalized modern world and the extremists that don't accept the values of the modern world. Very unclear what they'd like to replace it with, but maybe what's going on in the places that ISIS governs is a potential vision into what they believe about the future. And then the fifth different civil war is the Islamists versus the statists, I would call them, or maybe the Democrats. I wish there were more true, strong democratic movements within the Middle East, but you have the statists, the Islamists being those who want political Islam to be the governing force in the region, and then the statists not accepting that, looking for a strong secular state. So these fights are all about what the future, these civil wars are all about what is the future going to portend in the Middle East. And it's a fight that I think is going to take maybe possibly a couple of decades to play itself out. What is going to be the new governing principle in the new Middle East, the post-explosion? And right now we're in this period of turmoil where there's a lot of uncertainty and all these conflicts taking place at exactly the same time and sometimes over in the same territory. Now ISIS has been able to rise and be successful because these movements do well in times of grave instability and in places where there are no strong governance and governing principles. that is when extremists thrive, and that is what ISIS has been able to do. They fill the vacuum of the void that is left. The last point I want to make before closing is that I think this can be an inflection point in the Middle East. And a lot of what Bruce was saying, which I fully agree with, a lot of these countries, the crisis of ISIS, and I think more broadly, with all these multiple civil wars, a lot of these countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, are being forced to ask themselves, what do we believe? What are we for? What sides are we on these various conflicts? What is our vision of a new Middle East and what it will look like? What role will we play in constructing this new order? And a lot of them don't have easy answers to those questions. And a lot of answering those questions forces them to address some of their inner demons, perhaps. We can talk more specifically what I mean about that with respect to different countries. So I think the United States action and trying to gather allies and actually requiring of allies to do some things in this conflict that they're not very comfortable doing is forcing these countries to show their cards, put their cards on the table. And to the extent they're not willing to put their cards on the table, that tells something about what, whether they're willing to confront some of those inner demons. So I'll leave it at that. I hope I've been maybe provocative, maybe overly so. But when you get the more nitty-gritty questions about Canada and ISIS, I'm happy to address those when we get to them. Thank you.
Well, so nothing like your first public comments at Duke University being about ISIS and beheadings and what have you, but that's the world that we are borrowing and stealing from our children. So we might as well start there. So what I actually want to do, mercifully not showing us the images of those horrific beheadings, but to actually begin with the images that are haunting many of us. I want to begin with James Foley, with Alan Henning, with Stephen Sotloff, with David Haynes, and to ask the question, why are they wearing orange?
Yes, is that rhetorical?
Yeah.
Get money.
Right. So orange is not a popular color. Most men do not simply have an abundance of orange shirts and orange pants and certainly orange jumpsuits. What ISIS is doing in their own violent, evil, savage, barbarian, grotesque fashion is to hold up this ugly mirror, reminding us of people that we'd much rather forget about. Those 160 plus prisoners in Guantanamo, many of whom have been held for about a decade without any access to due process, about 100 of whom have gone on hunger strikes because they would rather be dead than to be continuously held in the indefinite imprisonment that they're being held in. And the response of your government, my government, has been, rather than providing them with an actual court process, to shove feeding tubes up their nose twice a day, artificially forcing them to stay alive until they die. There is simply no end in immediate sight, and if there is, that would be 10 years without a legal process. What I want to start with is this question of what does ISIS have to say, not about them, right? Their savagery, their brutality, their hatred of women, of Christians, of Yazidis, of Shia, of Sufis, and of Sunni Muslims that they don't agree with them is already well documented. I want to ask the question of what is happening to our democracy? What is happening to the values that we supposedly cherish in our own country? What do we do in a world in which the two options seem to be an ineffective United Nations, where the powerful, the United States and Russia, seem to be able to stop the consensus of the world community from being implemented on one hand, and the last gasp effort of the United States as the unipolar military presence in the world. Economically, we're already transitioning into a new world in which China and perhaps soon India will be co-players alongside the United States. Education and the military are the two areas in which the United States can still lay claim to being a supreme power. We still spend more on our military than the next 12 countries combined. Democrat and Republican alike agree that that's how it should be. And I want to ask the question of what does our global presence as an empire, and I think there's little reason to hide the fact that that's what we are. No other country has military bases on 100 other countries. No other country behaves like this. No other country would be allowed to behave like this. Imagine your panic if you woke up and China had military bases off the coast of South Carolina, Alaska, France, Germany, South Africa, Egypt, India, and yet that's what the United States does. And I want us to ask the question of what does it mean if we start to see the militarization of America pervading every aspect of our society? What does it mean that the police force who demonstrated such violence in Ferguson were actually sent to Israel? What does it mean if NYPD, LAPD, Denver PD have all undergone such anti-terrorism training, treating the urban population of America, which means primarily black and brown bodies, as potential terrorist targets? What does it mean that the tear gas canisters used on the population of Ferguson carried the exact same inscription on them, made by the same companies that were used this summer in Gaza? That's not only a Middle East question, that's also an America question. That's also a who are we and who do we want to be question. And who is the we? And what is the relationship of this we towards black and brown bodies? Black and brown bodies not only around the world, but also right here in the United States. I want us to also have the opportunity to ask some of those difficult questions of what does it mean when in this time of economic turmoil that we're slowly crawling our way out of, we are told repeatedly that we don't have money for education, we don't have money for housing, we don't have money for our children, we don't have money for the elderly, we don't have money for our streets and our schools, but somehow we seem to magically create these funds to fight these endless wars. I want us to ask the question of what do we do when we have repeatedly, over a period of decades, chosen strategic partnerships over our own democratic principles. And it's not a once or twice occasion. You can go through the line up the Shah of Iran, who was listed by human rights organizations as the worst offender of human rights in the world, President Mubarak, Netanyahu, the Saudi regime, Pervez Musharraf. It's a long list. If we wish to be seen globally as champions of freedom and democracy, then what are we doing with these autocratic regimes that are cracking down oftentimes at their own population? What do we do with that cherished principle of self-determination? Do we fundamentally believe that there are people in this world who do not deserve self-determination? They're not ready for it, they're not evolved for it? And if that's what we truly believe, then let's come out and say it. Because that argument has a long lineage in colonial discourse. Including, and while I won't waste any of my time on Bill Maher, including in classical liberalism, where very often when you would ask Hobbes and Locke and whoever else whether they really meant that all men are endowed with rights and rationalism, they'll be like, no, we don't mean those folks over there, we mean us over here. And I want to know if we have evolved beyond that point today to the notion that all human beings struggle and strive and deserve to be free. to be free from the tyranny of their own society and free from the tyranny of the world in which we all too often end up imposing on them. This question of what do we have to say and what is our response in this morally convoluted, politically difficult, tortured world of ours is one that I want to also ask the question of what do our religious traditions have to offer us? Oftentimes what we are told is that the best and the most that we can do is do no evil, right? If there used to be 5 pillars of Islam, now there's 6. And the 6th one is hate and condemn. Get up in the morning, brush your teeth, hate and condemn, hate and condemn, hate and condemn, hate and condemn. Every terrorist, hate and condemn stuff before it happens. Hate and condemn stuff that might happen next week, right? Can we do more than hating and condemning? Are we actually able to have our religious traditions be, to echo the 25th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, a place where you put your concern and the love of God into the least of God's children? Are we able to ask who's vulnerable in our own local society and who's vulnerable around the world? And who speaks for them? Who speaks for the people that have no one lobbying for them? Who speaks, should we be concerned about the thousands of people that ISIS, ISIL, IS, Daesh has killed? Absolutely. Every single one of those victims was somebody's baby. Every single one of those lives was precious and sacred, not only because, from my point of view, they're created by God in the image of God, but because they were somebody's baby, somebody stayed up at night suffering over them. Somebody stayed up at night feeding them, nursing them, changing their diaper. But the question for us is, who mourns the unmourned? What Fanon would have called the non-persons of history. If ISIS has killed a few thousand people, what do we have to say as a world community about the 200,000 people killed in Syria? If you think that the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem is bad, and it is, 4 to 5 million refugees around the world, in the last few years we've seen a refugee crisis in Syria which is double that size. 3 million refugees to other countries, 6.5 million refugees internally displaced. Why is there not an international coalition to address that suffering? And as somebody who considers himself a small d Democrat, I also want to know, when are we also going to be taking a look in the mirror of our own policies? Who speaks, who mourns for the 2,000 to 3,000 civilians that have been killed as a result of American drones? Who is responsible for the sanctions in Iraq that have led to the death of tens of thousands of human beings? And what I want to end with and open it up for conversation is that comment of the prophetic tradition, which puts the love of God into the concern for the least and most marginalized people of human community. And in this case, Rabbi Heschel, whose papers just moved to Duke. We had a chance to hear from his daughter, Susanna Heschel, earlier last week. When Heschel cries out, in the depth of the Vietnam War, is all mercy gone? If mercy, the mother of humility, is still alive as a demand, how can we say yes to our bringing agony to that tormented country? It means Vietnam. We're here because our own integrity as human beings is decaying in the agony and merciless killing done in our name. In a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible. And that's the question I just want to end my portion with. ISIS is guilty. ISIS is guilty of savage brutality. But the question that Rabbi Heschel and the prophetic tradition is posing to us is not that American Muslims are responsible and that Iraqis worldwide are responsible. All human beings are responsible. And what have we got to say? What have we got to say about the suffering, not only of the James Foley and the David Henning, and the other journalists and aid workers, who is responsible for the suffering of the non-persons of history whose name never makes the headlines? Well, thank you for coming. Have a lovely evening. So we're happy to open it up, and we have gotten some questions already sent to us, but I think the better option is to give preference to folks that have actually shown up here. Sattar, and if you would kindly direct your question to one of the distinguished panelists.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I have a question for Professor Bruce and David, because they touched on very important issue here. ISIS is the problem now. And the United States is leading the world to defeat ISIS. But there is a big question. What's the strategy to defeat ISIS? Suddenly, Assad regime or Assad is a de facto ally now. He is out of mind. And the Syrian Free Army has been asked to fight ISIS and join the Kurds. They can't do it, and they are going to lose their popular support. They are going to be weakened. Secondly, the United States is trying now to rebuild the Iraqi army. And 2 weeks ago, after 2 months of training, they left their base. They are coming from the south. They cannot fight. They lack the will to fight. They have their own privilege, you see. So again, the United States is riding the wrong horses in Iraq. And the Minister of Interior of the new government, according to the State Department, I read that in the Telegraph, is the leader of the death squad who is drilled to drill the minds of his people. This is the modern, the new Minister of Interior with the new government. And I heard from Washington, a diplomat told me the United States rejected that. But Iran wanted a representative from Badr Brigade, and they nominated this guy, the Iraqi government. The Prime Minister didn't like him, but he was, this is the problem now. What is their strategy? We need to mobilize the people on the ground. I watched the BBC America 2 months ago. An American retired general said, if we don't have a strategy to sort it out on the ground, we need to think it twice. This is ill advice. What is the strategy to sort it out on the ground? The people, the Syrian people and the Iraqi people, this is their job. And General Petraeus in 2007 tried and worked with the Anbar people, and they defeated Al-Qaeda. So this is the 3rd month. United States, Britain, Canada, France, for 3 months bombing guerrilla, terrorists. If they bomb that country, it is destroyed now. These people melt with the population, and they receive support. Saudi Arabia is not willing to fight, but they know next target will be Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi people will support ISIS.
Okay, let's give Bruce a chance to begin the response. Thank you.
So this is a question, what's the strategy?
Well, I'll say something controversial. I don't really think we have a strategy to defeat ISIS. I believe our strategy is to contain ISIS. The airstrikes are, I think we've shown that we've been able to blunt ISIS's movement, its ability to gather new territory, to perhaps put them on the defensive a bit, but not everywhere. And I think Bruce is correct that the idea here is to buy time. But I think you've raised some very important issues, which is to defeat ISIS or to roll it back, to reverse some of the territorial gains it has made, will require much more effective, greater commitment from the countries in the region, whether it's the Iraqi army, Free Syrian Army, Peshmerga, Turkish armed forces, the Jordanian armed forces.
And the people that
those entities could roll back ISIS's gains. I believe they have the power to do so, and obviously you're right, when there is a momentum and an opposition, then the people in the region will have the be stimulated, I think, to join against them. Right now, they're terrified. They're not doing anything. But it's really going to be up to those countries and those people to decide what they're all about, what they want to be about. Are they willing to put their cards on the table? I think that the United States has made a very wise decision in limiting its engagement to force these countries to stand up and say what they're willing to do. There are a lot of folks who say, you know, we're going to need the U.S. ground troops to remove these because, but I think that exacerbates all the old problems. It allows the others to be free riders on the United States and will not contribute to the development of a real new Middle East. It just will pour all the same old things about intervention and empire and all of those things. And so that's why I think from the US perspective, we're doing enough to contain ISIS and limit the threat that ISIS might cause to the US, but I really don't think we have a strategy to defeat ISIS. I'd be very interested to see what my colleague Bruce says.
No, I mean, I agree generally, and I think your points are good ones. I think that the initial use of airstrikes was to buy time. We have not used the time to develop the other aspects of the strategy. It very much, this is, you know, very much is what I said before, this needs to be with allies, not for them. It's, you know, for many of these regimes and for some of the peoples, it's an existential threat. The United States, it's a threat that could be significant, but it's not there. And so there needs to be, you know, political dimension. I quite frankly, you know, think we over-personalize things as we did with the Iraqis and Prime Minister Maghraoui. He was part of the problem. You know, part of what made the surge get some traction when it happened was the promise that Sunnis would be given, you know, a piece of the action, you know, political power, economic opportunities, places that didn't happen, right? I don't think if we kept troops there another 5 or 10 years that that would have changed it. So we changed prime ministers and people made a lot about that. It's not just the individual, it's being constrained by other factors. And I think we should be, quite frankly, talking to the American people and others and telling it like it is. You know, this is really, you know, the Iraqis need to make these changes if they want to be able to survive. On Syria, so if we were to leave this room at the end of this and say, oh wow, suddenly ISIS is, whatever they call it, degraded, you never destroy it. It's like saying you're going to eliminate crime in American cities, right? It never goes away, right, totally. But I think it was important to block the momentum. But even if something like that happened with ISIS, as I said before, the Syrian problem was there before we paid attention to ISIS, right? And that's where I think my own view is that there's an opportunities there. Here I'm going to talk diplomatically for a second, with both the Russians and the Iranians to do what I've been calling sort of a little bit more of an outside-in strategy. No matter how much support you give to the Free Syrian Army or anybody else, as long as Russia and Iran continue to support Assad and see that is in their interest, it's not going to be very effective. So what's the lesson here of ISIS, for example, for Iran? Well, I think the lesson to me is that they overplayed their hand by supporting Maliki and having him do things that were very pro-Shia. And what did they end up with? They ended up with a security threat. You know, so their interests are the same in both Iraq and Syria, but maybe the strategy for pursuing those interests is different, right? Similarly with the Russians, you know, some of the leaders of ISIS are Chechens, okay? Talking about something that Putin really worries about. So, you know, there's some possibilities there, and this is where you need to be as savvy in your diplomacy as you are anywhere else, to find ways to work, I think, to explore whether you can work with the Russians and the Iranians to bring the Syrian conflict to a point where you begin to move towards a political transition. That's not going to solve all the problems, and a lot's happened there, and it'll be ages before Syria is stable. But it's not just about more weapons or anything like that. I think you really need to figure out where the power structure is and try to move Syria to the next stage, because even if there's no ISIS, there's the issues of destabilization of the region from a lot of sources that my colleagues talked about, but emanating particularly from Syria.
I just want to make a quick point there, and I asked Bruce what he thinks about this, but it seems to me our timing was out of sync. We said we wanted to buy time, and I agree with that. We're trying to contain ISIS and buy time, but the time it takes to rebuild the Iraqi army, which we spent $25 billion building, and they melted away like nothing. The time to train these forces for Syria was a much, much longer timeline than 3 months, 6 months even. So it seems like our timing has never really been in sync.
I would only say I don't think we should be taking on the task of rebuilding the Iraqi army. We tried that once before, too. It's really up to the Iraqis to rebuild their army and to have some political inclusion that makes some things possible in Iraq that will not be possible without political inclusion.
I'll just make a couple of very quick sort of comments, and one of them is, beware of your convenient friends. So if ISIS came to the world's attention before the beheadings with their destruction of shrines, right? We have to ask the question, where have we seen this before? So in the first few months of them gaining traction, we saw them destroy the shrine attributed to the prophet Jonah, in Mosul, the Chaldean cathedral, in Tikrit, the Assyrian church, and also Shi'i and Sufi sites, Al-Qubbat al-Husayniyya, Sa'id ibn Aqil, and a shrine attributed to Ahmad Rifai. Well, that's straight out of the Wahhabi handbook, right? The destruction of shrines which are seen as being insufficiently Muslim is something that we've seen as part and parcel of Wahhabi ideology, both in Iraq itself, but also, and even more importantly, in the cities of Mecca and Medina, where 90% of Islamic holy sites, sacred sites, have been demolished. And apparently there's no problem putting up Victoria's Secret shops and Paris Hilton shops in their place. What do we do when the ISIS folks, to the extent that they read, and one should never overestimate the degree of religious literacy of these folks. What do we do with the fact that right before they leave US and Canada to go to Iraq, they're going on Amazon and literally ordering a book called The Complete Idiot's Guide to Islam, right? So on one hand, we're not really dealing with a high level of religious literacy, but to the extent that they are passing out religious paraphernalia and books, it's books like Kitab al-Tawheed of the founder of Wahhabi ideology, right? So how do we hold our convenient allies responsible for their own strain of extremist Islamic ideology, which is in many ways the virus that is showing up in all these different Muslim movements? And then the second one is, how do we learn from our previous mistakes? When do we learn from the fact that upon, I would add, illegally waging war on Iraq in 2003 and replacing Saddam Hussein, evil dictator, may he rot in hell, is that we began by dividing the country into a sectarian line along ethnic divisions, which was something that many policymakers and at least historians argued against, recommending the establishment of ideologically based political parties as opposed to Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds over there. That kind of divide and conquer strategy, which is something that comes right out of the colonial handbook, almost never ends well. What do we do with the fact that we disbanded the entire Ba'athist Iraqi army, right? The high-level Ba'athists, of course, had a massive amount of blood on their hand. But what do you do when you disband tens of thousands of military officers? Lo and behold, quite a few of them end up looking for jobs, end up finding their way into these jihadist militaristic groups. We know that one of the higher-ranking military officers of ISIS is this guy named Izzat Ibrahim ad-Duri at-Takriti, who was on the deck of cards that we put right after the invasion of Iraq. So how do we also learn from some of our previous mistakes that we have committed there?
Yes, thank you. I think it is also very important. I mean, I'm aware of how the external factors or policies of the United States, Europe, or and the region really are affecting the dynamic. But I think what we see, I mean, at least from an understanding of the Arab Spring, I mean, I think that the failures really expose some of the insidious legacies of the authoritarian regimes. One of them is the religious extremism, the weaknesses of the local institutions. And I think that it is important to keep in mind, well, look, I mean, these failures, the religious extremism is also, the product of half century of policy of the states of the region, and so I think it's should the United States or external pressure of Saudi Arabia stop its influence, it's not going to necessarily resolve the problem. So it is really, there are some challenges that the societies and the states in the region will have to face up to.
Back there, yes.
I had a question inspired by something that David said, but it's for whomever would like to take it. When you delineated the 5 different types of civil wars that were ongoing, one of them was between modernists and extremists. And you characterized the modernists as people that would ascribe to a notion of wanting to belong to a globalized modern world, which in many cases is usually euphemism for Western, European, or American. There are obviously a huge chunk of people that would fall into a more middle ground between modernism and extremism. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on who those people are as current actors right now, and if you don't see anybody that falls into that group, where there is the potential for that to arise.
Well, I think a good strand of the forces that led to the Al-Qaeda ideology were about a disconnect between the traditions and the notions of the antiquated world and the conflicts that the modernism was bringing to it. And they're an oppositional movement, and they are oppositional to the notion of globalization. I think it's definitely true that there are countries and regions of the world that have been left out of globalization, but very much desire to be part of that, not necessarily incorporating Western values, but South America is much more connected to the global economy. Many societies throughout Asia are, economically vibrant and are, working to connect and be part of the global economy. And those are positive, stabilizing influences, as far as I'm concerned. So it's not, globalization is just not, in my view, a Western phenomenon. And listen, look at the UN development report for the Arab world. Abdeslam knows exactly what year, but I'm thinking 2005, 2006, but just about how the Middle East has lagged on a full series of economic indicators. And to me, whatever kinds of, you want stability, you want progress, you want more peace, less extremism coming out of the Middle East, to me, a big part of the solution is incorporating those regions more into the global economy, allowing them to have better prosperity and growth. Yeah, I mean, I just think that's a critical part of relieving a lot of the sources of both the extremism and other problems that we see in the Middle East.
I'd like to follow up on something that Bruce said at the end about changing the dynamics among some of the actors in the region. And here's the question, whether there's anything we can learn about the dynamics of a period a little while ago, 1989 to about 1993, when three distinct developments, radical and relatively sudden, changed the psychology in the Middle East, even if for just a brief period of time, and then it vanished. But there were a couple of years where things were actually very positive. The psychology was amazing. Starting with the, in 1989, when the United States, Israel, Syria, and Saudi Arabia actually came together to try to solve the Lebanese civil war and succeeded with the Taif Accord. The coalition against Saddam Hussein in Kuwait, which led to a Madrid peace process where Israel sat down at the table with the others, and then finally, of course, the Oslo discussions, talks between the PLO and the Israelis. This was sudden, new dynamics, and I think some were able to capitalize on this. Is there anything we can draw from that to say, today, perhaps we can do something similar to change the equations?
Those are good points, David, and I think some of it was contextual. You know, the end of the Cold War set a particular context for some of that to happen. But let me talk at least about Oslo. I mean, it was 2 points. One, you know, Ladbrokes, Las Vegas, nobody could have gotten good odds, right, that wouldn't happen, and it did, right? It wasn't a given. And I think that what that demonstrated at the time, first of all, was leadership. On the part of particularly Prime Minister Rabin and Yasser Arafat, through a quiet diplomacy process till they were really ready to come out. And I was actually in the Clinton administration in the State Department in 93, 94, where this was going on, the lead from academia, and there was a sense of, you know, of changing the notions of what was possible. 20 some odd years later, that still is there among some people. And ironically, I actually find it among not the armchair strategists, not the politicians, but in fact many of the pragmatic, you know, military and other security leaders in the region, okay? I'll just give you one example. If anybody has ever seen the documentary movie, The Gatekeepers, which was an Israeli movie that was nominated for an Academy Award a couple years ago, didn't win. And it's interviews with 6 of the 7 living heads of the Shin Bet. And to a person, they might be hawkish on Iran, but they talk about what I said before, why Israeli security would be served by peace with the Palestinians. These are guys who are pretty hard-headed, they ain't, you know, naive, but they understand the scope and limits of force and coercion. A couple of whom were writing articles right before this and during this most recent Gaza war. So I think there's a sense there, you know, of what's possible and what serves interests. The other point I wanted to say is about leadership, and you go back to Sadat's trip to Jerusalem. You know, that was seen as, you know, it changed the narrative, it changed the mindset, it changed the paradigm. In the same way that Rabin, who had been, you know, a military leader who had been in charge of security in the West Bank and, you know, doing all of that. And so to me, some of it has to come, you know, sort of bottom up from people, middle out from institutions, and some of it has to come top down from leaders who are willing to make those kind of breakthroughs that a Gorbachev did, you know, in the Soviet Union, that a Mandela did coming out of prison after 27 years and going for reconciliation rather than retribution. You know, the only positive I can say about all these things that give us this region in profound turmoil, you know, is maybe when you see how terrible things are, it gives you an incentive to be a leader. And I think that it would be hard. I mean, after all, what happened to both Rabin and Sadat, they got assassinated. But I think we need some of that leadership as well as working, you know, about the institutions and many other aspects in the region. So, you know, I'm not Pollyannish, but I think those elements still carry forward.
Hi. I was wondering if you, and this could, all 3 panelists could answer because it's about Yemen, and Yemen went through the Arab uprisings. But I was wondering if you could comment on the crisis that's ongoing in Yemen, especially given that there's been very little international attention given to it, with President Hadi's government being, he's lost control of the capital to the Houthis. I just want to hear you comment on that in general, and maybe like also what hand Iran has or, you know, has not had in this
crisis and how the U.S. should respond to this regional development, and then how it plays into this discussion we've had here today.
I mean, very briefly, I mean, Yemen is encountering the similar challenges that, Libya, Yemen, all these, fragmented societies. I mean, Yemen is very fragmented along ethnic, religious lines, regional lines. And again, I mean, I hate to go back to it again. I mean, the absence of institutions that are reliable, that can, provide a platform to negotiate those kind of divisions are lacking in Yemen. I'm not sure if there is the silver bullet kind of solution to what's happening, except to say, well, you really need to start from the bottom up. I mean, from the bottom up, it's very important. Yes, leadership is important, but there has to be a need, a process of building this institution. It's time-consuming, it's difficult, and it's long-term. And sometimes Washington clock doesn't fit with the process going on in the region, so it has to be a lot of patience. I mean, I'm not sure how successful was this campaign to contain the religious extremists, and then as elsewhere in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, wherever there is an institutional vacuum, they come in, they consolidate various factions, and paradoxically, they are the ones, I mean, the Islamic State, in a way, formed to establish new institutions. I mean, once they took over, the first declaration was, well, how are we going to run this community? It's not democratic, it is brutal, but at the same time, it is establishing the rules of how they are going to govern themselves. And that just really illustrates the need for people in the region to cling to some institutions just to make sense of their lives.
Yes, thanks. Questions for Professor Jentleson. You spoke about leadership and the role of the Arab-Israeli process, and up until this point, the U.S. has kind of been the lead arbiter in the Arab-Israeli process. And there's been success when U.S. presidential engagement has been met by strong domestic support for Arab-Israeli leaders. After Gaza, the continued settlements, the role of Hamas, what's the new model for engagement going forward, and what does the region look like in the absence of a peace process?
Yeah, it's a good question, Tyler, because I think that as I said before, there are people that are saying the two-state solution is dead and we've got to move to something else. It's definitely in the emergency room, but I just don't see anything else that goes with the word solution, possibly. And this is still very complicated as, issues of borders and security and all that sort of thing. I think when Secretary Kerry came into office, many of the so-called wise heads in Washington said, don't waste your time, but he was committed to trying old-fashioned diplomacy. And it didn't succeed for a variety of reasons, and I think there's a lot of fault to go around. There is this sense, paradoxically, even with many of the things we've been critical of, not only contemporaneously, but historically in the United States, that there is still some credibility of the U.S. as a broker in the region. I actually think that other alternatives need to be explored. For example, the question that was before the UN General Assembly about whether or not to set, a fixed date by which, Palestine would be accepted as a state. I haven't thought enough about that to know what its pros and cons are, but I'm not prepared to reject it like some people are out of hand. I think that there's a variety of ways. Another set of people start to talk about arms control agreements where you don't necessarily sign a treaty, but you observe the agreement, And in some ways, you almost create a competitive marketplace of ideas where there'll be a variety of ideas. The other thing I think is important is the importance of quiet diplomacy in track twos. The Oslo process happened, the key breakthroughs were in a little hunting lodge up in Norway, where you could keep things quiet, and my analogy was until the flower is ready to go out of the greenhouse, you keep it inside, and then you made it public and you brought it to Washington. I feel that way about the Iranian relationship too. What's possible through quiet diplomacy, through track twos, to get things going out of the limelight. There are a lot of efforts going on in that direction. So, I think we need to look at alternative models. My own view is I don't think the United States, I don't think the United States should re-engage in that brokering role until it's genuinely convinced that the two parties in this particular case, the Palestinians and the Israelis, want an agreement more than we do. And I don't think we were there in January 13, and I think that ultimately never got fixed. So I'm open to other alternatives, including some that we haven't mentioned there, but track twos and some UN process could conceivably be effective.
In the way back.
Well, thank you for this fascinating conversation. It really has been a pleasure to hear from all of you. Omid and I were wondering, do you see the recent energy revolution as having any potential impact for our willingness to engage in the region and our posture in the Middle East? In addition, does it represent a shift in policy, or will it be perceived as having potential impact by our allies?
I'll start the conversation, and I'm happy to defer to my more learned colleagues. Very simply, if the conversation is about the energy revolution, look, the blessing and the curse of the Middle East over the last 100 years has been oil. And it's a finite commodity. Oil alone is perhaps second only to Palestine and Israel as one of the driving factors for first British and then American involvement in the region. But it's a commodity that's going to run out. Scholars can debate, are we talking 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and it's going to be gone. And the question is, what will you have done with these hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth that you've generated? Some of the societies which either never had a significant amount of oil, Turkey would be the prime example, have already shifted to a global economic model in which they're thriving, they're successful, and actually to a large extent they've proven themselves to be immune from many of the collapses of the global economic infrastructure. Dubai might be another place where they've very much positioned themselves, in spite of my loathing for the aesthetic of the place, as the great shopping mall of the world. And let's just not talk about slavery while we're at it. Other places, and here Saudi Arabia would come to mind predominantly, what you gonna do after the oil runs out? What have you invested in as a model for 21st century and 22nd century education, industry, technology? And I think there's a lot of questions to be asked. Frankly, Iran is not far behind in that particular conversation. And if you want to have a nightmare scenario for oil driving foreign policy, all you have to do is to look at Central Asia, where the anxiety is that they're sitting on natural gas reservoirs and mineral reservoirs which might rival the oil that we saw in Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia over the course of the last 100 years. And God have mercy on us if the US, Turkey, and Russia end up engaging in a similar kind of colonial politic that the US and Britain have engaged in over the last 100 years there.
Yeah, I would just say I don't sort of totally buy the word revolution with the energy situation. It's like people talk about energy independence. Whatever's happening in the United States in terms of our domestic production, first of all, it's more carbon-based fuels, and you still got global climate change. But secondly, financial markets would be dramatically hit by any major interruption in Middle East oil, for China, for Europe, for India, and financial markets will affect us too. So I don't think it changes that, that profoundly. I agree with what Omid was saying about, the oil curse and these other aspects of it, and I think moreover, I think that if there is the public policy, what we call a public good there, a collective action, why is it the United States Navy that takes almost sole responsibility for keeping the Straits of Hormuz open? Why not have the Chinese and the Japanese and others also participating in that? I don't worry that they're going to somehow gain regional hegemony. That's not part of the 21st century world. So I think there are a lot of changes we could make, and you could play off the notion that we have more domestic production. But we're not going to be energy independent because of the interconnections of financial markets and others.
There and then over here. Yes, sir.
Do any of the actions, thoughts, or practices of ISIS conform with the Quran? And if they don't, which I assume that they don't, where are the moderate Arabs, whether they be nation states or if they be citizens in America or visitors to America, where are their voices?
Right. I'm happy to take that one. So let me direct you to a column that I published not too long ago with Krista Tippett. Krista is one of our leading journalists on issues of religion. She recently received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama. And my first column that I wrote with her was a reflection on how do we talk about religion and the public good in a world of ISIS. And you can go to onbeing.org. And embedded in that particular blog are a couple of pieces that might be of interest to you. One of them is an open letter that is addressed to the so-called caliph of ISIS, this nobody kid who just declared himself Khalifa. And if it were that easy, then I would declare myself, I don't know, like the starting center for the Chicago Bulls, and or Duke, you know. No, mind you, what it's talking about. And it's only at UNC that the students get to do illegal, unethical things. And, ooh, that's low, that's low. And so that particular letter was signed by religious leaders, and I'm just going to read this list. Egypt, Jordan, Nigeria, United States, Turkey, Yemen, Palestine, Malaysia, Portugal, France, Indonesia, Morocco, Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Italy, Bulgaria, Sweden, UK, Germany, Iraq, Indonesia, Bosnia, Pakistan, Sudan, Iceland, we got Muslims there too, Mauritania, and Kurdistan, right? That's just one small sample. But the issue that you raise, where are the voices of the moderate Muslims, this has been sort of a perennial question since 9/11. David Schanzer and our colleague Charlie Korsman at UNC have done a magnificent job documenting many of these voices, creating websites for them. Certain people who shall not be named, me, have sent catalogs of these statements and pronouncements to Tom Friedman and other kind of folks, and yet we still hear them year after year write these kinds of blogs about where are the moderate voices, why are they so silent, which I think leads us to ask the question, is it that people are not speaking up, or is it that we're not hearing it? Is it that we're not listening to it? And if it should happen to be the second, then I wonder what that says about our preconceived notion of a majority of Muslims worldwide secretly being complicit. Regardless of what they do, regardless of what they say, regardless of how many of their leading scholars, imams, experts denouncing the practices of ISIS, I don't know of a single Muslim organization or religious intellectual or imam or community leader over the course of the last year hasn't lost his or her voice hating and condemning, myself included. But what does it say about us if for some reason we still go on as if this voice isn't there? Because speaking and hearing is a two-way process. It's a reciprocal process. And partially what I fear is that the conversation about Islam today has largely become a conversation between Bill Maher and Ben Affleck. And you've got the otherwise cool liberal who hates all religion, but he just hates one of them much, much more than the other ones. And then the white guy that has to come to the defense of Muslims and saying, well, no, these are human beings too. And what's missing, of course, from that entire exchange are the voices of Muslims themselves. In a way that would be, I don't know, a little odd if we were having a discourse on Ferguson and we had 4 white guys sitting and discussing it. If we were having an exchange on women's rights and it was just a bunch of guys sitting around and discussing it. If we were having a conversation about urban poverty and we just had a bunch of corporate CEOs sitting and discussing it, right? So I think that issue of hearing from people who are, as a matter of fact, speaking, I think is something that is necessary for a robust and vibrant democracy.
Thank you.
Was there a question on that side first? Yes, there. and then there, and then there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question is for Professor Maghraoui and yourself. Do you think that classical liberalist policy is being, and unilateral action by the United States, do you think we're moving away from that with the most recent initiation of a coalition against ISIL?
Whether in the current coalition, the international coalition against ISIL, we're moving away from classic liberalist policies.
Oh, I see. Well, I'm not sure what you mean by the classic liberal policy, but I mean, for me, this is like the beginning of like a third, I would say, third intervention in Iraq and the region. And I mean, if we look, for the past 15 years or so, we see the militarization of U.S. policy in the region. That is, most of the intervention, the most significant, initiative in the region has been, in the form of military intervention. And that is really a problem. I think that my colleagues already raised a lot of questions about the absence of this strategy. I really don't know what the United States or even the coalition is going to do about ISIS. I'm not very, hopeful that it's going to be resolved through some kind of extended intervention. I mean, I go back to the importance of the local audiences, of the policies of the domestic states. But I think that Omid is right. We see that, well, I mean, I think that progressively throughout, since World War II, we see that, well, the U.S. has really gone itself in that place for a long period of time, no attention to the issue of democracy or human rights, and then increasing militarization, and they're not really sure how constructive is going to be, I mean, for the United States to be fully engaged in this conflict.
Just out of the interest of time, I'm mindful of the time of the day. Let me ask for the last two questions in sequence, and then we'll try to somehow weave them together. So I think Lily had a question, and there was another question there.
So, okay, I'll ask this quickly so we can get through. I hate to beat a dead horse about ISIS, but I'm very curious personally, and I'm sure others are, about the Kurdish question and what the international community owes to the Kurds. They are minorities. The Kurdish people are considered a minority in Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkey, because they're divided. But they're not very much a minority in reality. So what does the international community owe to the Kurds, and how does international cooperation with Kurds, the Kurdish people, reawaken the dialogue of the Kurdish question?
There was another question there as well.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting conversation. I want to thank you all for that. But I want to follow up a little bit on what this gentleman had to say back here. In the wake, I'd just like your opinion, in the wake of 9/11, to what extent is Islam itself in crisis? It seems like the conversation that should be going on would be between the so-called extremists like the self-proclaimed caliph and all others. But yet, when I don't see a lot of that conversation going on, and when I do, interestingly, I don't see any Quranic verses being cited as whether in violation of any of them. And I asked that question to a few of my Muslim friends, and I looked at a translated version of the Quran, and I was able to find justification for everything that Baghdadi is doing.
Well, I know Omid is going to follow up, but sometimes it's good for a non-Muslim to stand up and say something about these issues. Listen, religion is about interpretation of texts. Texts have a history, they have context. They have a lot of nasty things in them, as does the Old Testament, as does the New Testament. And so religion is about how we interpret texts. So we could find literalistic interpretations of the New Testament, of the Old Testament, that could justify horrific things. And that's what these extremists do. They take a hyper-literalistic reading of certain phrases or words in the Quran. They divorce it from all historical context, and they use it to justify the atrocities that they want to do. And then what many people in the West do is they engage in the exact same interpretive flaws, divorced from all Islamic jurisprudence over the course of the centuries, divorced from all the rulings of renowned scholars and people with authority. These people don't have authority to, or the training to interpret for all Muslims these texts. But then the critics of Islam in the United States on the news, they do the exact same interpretive flaws as ISIS and bin Laden. They engage in the exact same ahistorical, non-contextual interpretation of the Quran and say, you see here, this is what it says. So I think we all have to think about those things, and let's not fall into that trap. Do you want to add to that?
Actually, why don't we just go down the line and have each person give their final remarks about both questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a way, I wish we could just like find this very simple solution. Say, well, yeah, and the reason why there is religious extremism and the reason why there is ISIS is because of the Quran. It's very simplistic. It's comforting. It makes it much simpler for us to comprehend. It is much more complicated, as my colleagues will say, and that you are going to find in the Bible, in the Old Testament, you know, images of catastrophic and hell, and the same thing in the Quran. We are talking about the 6th century. We are talking about, you know, references from and some are going to go to some specific references and use them to justify, to legitimate their action. But there's a whole strand of liberal reformers who have been, you know, writing since the 18th century about how to reform Islam, and they have made written treaties on reconciliation of Islam with democracy. They have found institutions and practices that are completely, you know, in tune with the democracy. I mean, I think that this is a really interesting question. It goes back to the idea of why there are no moderate voices, and it's almost like it's incriminating of the religion of the group. That unless whenever something bad happens somewhere, you have to stand up and defend and say, well, it's not in the Quran. I think we have to be careful not to reduce this idea, the problem that we are facing in the region to this simple text or reference in the Quran.
I would just say on that, I mean, Omid gave one or two examples in the distinction between voices that are out there and not being heard. And I think they're worth looking at and pursuing further, because there's quite a bit, of that kind of voice going on. I mean, particularly for people that don't want to be, tarred with that brush. But, I actually am more concerned about extremists generally, okay? Way back in the 1950s, a couple of psychologists at Yale did a study, what they called the authoritarian personality. At the time, they studied communists and fascists, and it shows the same basic personality structure. Need certainty, binary views of this and that. And to be honest with you, if you look at what's happening, and I'm not making a moral equivalence here to be heading by any stretch of the imagination, but if you look at what's happening in Israel today between the secular and the religious, and some of the ultra-Orthodox and what they are saying they are prepared to do to the soldiers of their own army if they come to evict them from settlements as part of the peace process. Or you can think of other examples, it happened in India with some extremism of Hindus, and what's happening with Buddhists in terms of Burma now. So there is a whatever the flavor, the extremists are very dangerous, I think, to any notions of civil society and coexistence. And so, we are paying a lot of attention to that within Islam. There are other voices there, but if we see it in that context, I think it gives it some sense. On the Kurdish question, He phrases, what do the international community owe the Kurds? I don't really know the total answer to that. But I don't think that, I don't think there's going to be a Kurdish state for at least two main reasons. One is it would involve at least 3 or 4 countries in the region: Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And secondly, it's not clear to me that the Kurds of all those countries necessarily want to be part of the same state. I think that the continued emphasis on greater autonomy and federalism in Iraq, and something hopefully to come out of Syria, is probably where that's going to go. Maybe in a few generations it'll change. But I don't know that, other than certain leaders who would like to have that, I don't think that, Turkish Kurds necessarily want to be part of the same state as Iraqi Kurds. So I think it's going to be, more protection, more awareness, more autonomy, but I don't see a redrawing of borders, including for reasons that involve the Kurds, not just the countries with vested interests.
Thank you. So, as much as it pleases me to have, the banner of the Duke Islamic Studies Center behind us and to say, if you're interested, come to our events and take our classes and everything, I'm also interested in broadening the conversation, historicizing the conversation, and just, a quick little reminder, let's just remember that slavery, colonialism, and institutional sexism were all things that historically have been legitimized through selective interpretation of the Bible as well. So I think part of what we want to do is to ask the question that how is it that religion and religious interpretations, religious practices are things that people bring their values to? For some people, it's a liberatory value. For some people, it's an oppressive, violent value. How do we study that? How do we talk about it in a way that frankly has intellectual rigor and merit, so that it doesn't sound like me sitting there issuing Supreme Court decisions all by myself, which has exactly the same intellectual merit as someone like Baghdadi issuing decrees as a Khalifa of Islam. And in coming back to the Kurdish question, I think that's actually a wonderful point to bring our conversation to a selective end, because I really see this as going back to the point that David so nicely started our conversation with, which is that the entire region, over the course of the last 200 years, has been undergoing this process of transformation from multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires. The Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire. And today, we are trying to fit a very diverse population into the world of nation states, some of them crumbling, failing nation states. If you happen to be an ethnic or religious minority that didn't fit in a particular nation state model, which includes embedded in it a certain structural institutional privilege, if you happen to be a Pakistani Christian, an Iranian Baha'i, an Arab Muslim in Gaza and the West Bank, a Kurd in Turkey, what's your status? Are you a full, complete, and equal citizen of these countries, or are you at best a tolerated guest? And so part of the place that I would personally like to have my own life's conversation go to is not trying to carve out a multinational Kurdish state or carving out ever smaller and smaller Arab states out of the West Bank, out of Gaza, to carve out a Pakistani Christian state, an Iranian Baha'i state, but to really come back to the conversation of citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen, and how do we guarantee equal rights for people, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation, of their ethnicity, of their race, of their religion, and to insist on that as the very basis of the social contract that actually brings us together. And it would be good to also carry that conversation over to the United States, where our notion of who we are as a people is also something that perpetually needs to be formed in every generation. So let me thank you for your time, and thank the panelists for their erudition and excellence.